Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance, safeguarding the dream of property ownership. The ghost of Bob La Follette. Today, everyone has an election reform idea. A noble cause, or just trying to change who wins? In episode 12 of Lost in the Middle.
Mark Twain, I think, said it best.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive for what is wrong.
That scratchy 100-year-old recording is Wisconsin favorite son Bob La Follette, often regarded as one of the 5 best senators in U.S. history.
The call comes to every citizen. It is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. Each one should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America according to the plan of the fathers.
La Follette and his sometimes ally, but more frequently sparring partner Teddy Roosevelt, ushered a reform era into U.S. politics in the early days of the 20th century. Both were worried about the concentration of wealth, about growing inequality, and about the massive amount of money in politics.
They were concerned that the game was fixed.
That's one-time Wisconsin state historian Michael Stevens talking about the progressive era.
And you had a group of individuals who were looking for a way to change the status quo. And around 1900, the idea of progressivism coalesced. You had reformers nationwide looking at how did we get into this problem and what can we do about that.
La Follette was at the forefront of the movement. It's hard to believe that this one reform was even necessary.
In order to challenge the influence of political bosses, like, for example, in Tammany Hall, progressives wanted to put more of the voting power back into the hands of the people. And one way they sought to do this was through the secret ballot. In other words, that the voting could be done in secret. And you may wonder, isn't that how voting is done? Well, not prior to this. Like, one of the reasons these political bosses were able to keep power is that they doled out their favors to members of the community, and they did so in exchange for their votes. And when these folks came to vote, it was done in the plain sight of the bosses. So, of course, they had to make good on their promise.
This is from a lecture on progressive politics at a website called Heimler's History. But that was just the start.
The other thing that La Follette was successful in doing is he believed in referendum, recall, and initiative.
Perhaps his most famous reform as governor of Wisconsin was one that eventually swept the country: the direct election of senators, which had historically been done by the state legislature and by party bosses. He believed the only way to change that was through a referendum. Stevens one more time.
Well, La Follette, when he campaigned, he distributed literature. On one side of it supported Bob La Follette. On the other side was a reminder to vote yes on the referendum. So he would use his campaign machinery to campaign for both the cause and the man.
And now comes the history rhyme that Twain described.
So it certainly parallels the progressive reform era of about 100 years ago.
Catherine Gale sold her Wisconsin manufacturing company about 8 years ago, and since then has poured her considerable energy into the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers.
People are frustrated with the political system writ large and across the spectrum of ideology. And so then there's a subset of those people who are proposing certain, multiple different solutions. And I do believe that this kind of dissatisfaction will lead to voters grasping for change. They will grasp for change either in who they elect or how the systems themselves work, or both.
That same evangelical zeal to reform today's politics echoes those familiar themes. It was then the concentration of wealth with Carnegie and Rockefeller. Today, Bezos and Koch. Too much money in politics led by railroad barons. Today, the era of super PACs. And rising inequality again shrinks opportunities for many. Last episode, we touched on redistricting reform and multi-party democracy. In this episode, ranked voting and open primaries. In part 2 of our stories on reform proposals, we begin in a very cold place with a very hot reform idea.
Do you want to see glaciers, bears, pan for gold? You name it, Alaska is the place.
And it's also home to a creative way to get out of gridlock, which delivered a major upset in a congressional special election in 2022.
More breaking news tonight, this time out of Alaska. We've got some projected results in a special election for a U.S. House seat. The state's former governor, Sarah Palin, was in the runoff, but NBC News can project that Democrat Mary Peltola will win the seat.
Mary Peltola was the first Democrat elected to the House from Alaska in half a century. Supporters of ranked choice said the reform delivered because she campaigned as a centrist. Here's how it works. There's no Republican or Democratic primary election. All candidates run in a single primary. In this special election, voters rank their 4 choices, eventually leading to a final showdown between Peltola and one-time VP candidate Sarah Palin. Peltola told PBS she won because she emphasized her willingness to work across the aisle.
You get a campaign where both of the individuals are on both ends of the spectrum. Do I want someone far, far left or far, far right? And all of their campaign promises have been about staying true to ideology, not compromising. And I have found that many partisan issues don't necessarily relate to a person's everyday life.
Anchorage pastor Andy Bartell is a fan of ranked voting.
Alaska, I think, is portrayed as this deeply red state, and yet there are a lot more people who are registered as nonpartisan than there are in either of the two parties. It allows people like me and other nonpartisan voters the opportunity to weigh in without having to necessarily commit ourselves to a particular party.
For now, Maine is the only other state which uses ranked voting, but it's bizarrely schizophrenic. Ranked voting is used in primaries for state elections and in the general election for federal elections only.
At the end of the day, voting should be simple, easy to understand, and anybody should be able to do it. And I think that ranked choice voting fails all of those tests, frankly. It makes voting a lot more complicated than it needs to be.
Jacob Posick is the legislative director at the Maine Policy Institute.
In Maine, since we have had RCV on the books, negative campaigning of all kind has gone through the roof. The amount of expenditures that are made by third-party groups, it went from, the last gubernatorial primary in Maine had no negative spending. Then we get RCV and there's hundreds of thousands of dollars spent negative campaigning.
The Alaska election has sparked a national fight over the new voting methodology. This summer, 5 states banned it from ever being adopted, joining another 5 with a ban already in place. Hell, even Alaska is unsure. There's a proposed measure this fall to repeal ranked voting. On the pro side, 4 states will soon allow it to be used in local elections. Swing state Nevada has a referendum in place this fall to allow it to be used in the elections in 2026. 2 major U.S. cities, New York and San Francisco, already use ranked choice in mayor's races. But research by Jason McDaniel at San Francisco State says those local elections have significant issues that should not be overlooked. People are often puzzled by the multiple voting dates and make ballot marking mistakes. Confusion's very high for people with lower education levels, and especially for immigrants who aren't native English speakers.
So the idea of ranking multiple candidates to me is something that right away I was like, this sounds like a kind of reform, progressive era reform, that what it does is it makes the voting task harder and will probably lead to less turnout and will probably lead to more ballot errors, right? And my research has shown that that's the case. My research has shown that turnout has declined.
Unless you're a political nerd, the odds are you're not going to be geeked by all these choices. Are you really going to know who these people are and what they stand for? I think you're just going to be bewildered.
So it's going to be uninformed choices. What will often be the case, I think, is they'll use race, ethnicity, last name, gender. Those things will come into play more and there's research to support this, in that context, because they need something to rank them. And there's no guarantee they know policy differences, ideological differences, substantive differences between candidates are not guaranteed to be transmitted to the voters very cleanly.
Seth Maskett at Denver University has his doubts about the real-world impact of ranked voting.
So the idea of actually doing like ranking a top 4 isn't going to really make that much of a difference. And you're going to get a Democrat and a Republican for the most part in the runoff. It might encourage a little more moderation from those candidates, but I don't think you're going to get a radically different, type of politician in there.
So is there evidence it's led to moderation? Well, take a look at California. In California, the top 2 candidates in the so-called jungle primary face off in the general. But because California is such a Democratic state, it's usually just one Democrat against another Democrat. And nobody has ever made the claim that California politics in Sacramento has shifted to the middle. But Alaska State Senator Kathy Giesel was a longtime GOP state senator who was beaten in a primary because she wasn't conservative enough. But she was reelected under the ranked voting system, which she told PBS now rewards moderates from both parties.
We have a bipartisan coalition. It's made up of 9 Democrats and 8 Republicans. So that's 17 out of 20 members came together and said, let's work together. The difference in running in this open primary is that you actually do have to talk to everyone. I walked up to doors and knocked on doors I had walked past previously because they weren't Republicans.
A new twist on ranked voting is picking up steam called Final Five. There are basically 2 steps. You vote in an open primary for any candidate you like, and then the top 5 finishers go to the general. Political reformer Catherine Gale is the most prominent supporter of Final Five.
The rules of the game in politics even make prisoners of our senators and representatives. Their only option is lockstep allegiance to their side of the divide. So what do we do about it? We change the rules. It's not what we think. It's not gerrymandering, not the Electoral College, not the absence of term limits, and not even money in politics. Really, Final Five voting gives voters more choice, more voice, and most importantly, better results.
Well, chances are you're not a political junkie, so let's go to the sports world to explain it. Let's use all-time great quarterbacks: Patrick Mahomes, Johnny Unitas, Peyton Manning, Joe Montana, and Brett Favre.
A strike from Favre. Touchdown, Green Bay, as the Packers recapture the lead.
Yeah, I'm a Packer homer, so I'd vote for Favre. And then I rank the other 4. So let's say your top pick, Manning, was now eliminated. So now his voters' second favorite quarterbacks get your vote. The card shuffling continues until we're down to the top 2, and then somebody wins.
Brett Favre's dad, he has to be swelling up proud. The final score here at Super Bowl 31 is the Green Bay Packers 35, the New England Patriots 21.
Advocates say the system is designed to elect a consensus candidate and squeeze out the fringe ones.
The ultimate purpose of Final Five voting is not necessarily to change who wins. It's to change what the winners are incentivized to do. Under this system, the message to Congress is do your job or lose your job. Innovate, reach across the aisle whenever it's helpful, and come up with real solutions to our problems and create new opportunities for progress. Or be guaranteed new and healthy competition in the next election.
Remember Mary Peltola, who won the ranked choice experiment in Alaska on a promise to buck her party? Well, she has. Well, sort of. On immigration issues and on energy issues, given Alaska's an energy-producing state, she votes that way if she wants to get reelected. Her party loyalty score shows she breaks with the party about 14% of the time. On the other side of the U.S. Capitol, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski breaks with her party 36% of the time. And she was elected the old-fashioned way, by just beating a single Democrat.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. Our country recognizes homeownership as one of the best ways to build wealth and stable communities. But over the years, support for homeownership has dwindled, and our leaders have lost sight of its value. We're working to change that. The American Property Owners Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that holds our leaders accountable to safeguard homeowners and communities. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to learn more and find out how you can join our efforts.
Since Bob La Follette's successful reform fight to let voters, not the legislatures, directly elect their senator, primary elections have been a fundamental building block of the election system. Proponents of open primaries point to Alaska as an important step, but many more primaries around the U.S. remain closed. 11 years ago, Nick Toriano ran as an independent for a congressional seat in Pennsylvania. After a one-sided loss, he founded a reform group called Unite America to advocate for more primary election reform. And he sees the Alaska experience as an important model.
I look at the winners of the statewide races in Alaska and see that a conservative Republican governor was reelected, a moderate Republican senator was also reelected, and a moderate Democrat won in an open seat for the U.S. House.
He wrote a new book, The Primary Solution, which argues that today's primary election structure pushes the most extreme candidates forward in both parties.
Right now, we have a system that overrepresents those at the fringes of both political parties at the expense of the majority. What was stunning to me is that in the last midterm elections, 83% of U.S. House races were not decided in November. They were decided in the primary elections months before November.
Listen to this startling statistic.
It was only 8% of voters nationally that cast ballots in those primaries that determined the outcome. So you have 8% of voters electing 83% of our leaders. It's no wonder why Congress doesn't represent us.
Remember, election rules are set by states, and America breaks down into 3 distinct primary rule clusters. Closed primaries only allow registered party voters to vote in a primary election. In 16 states, you have to be a Republican or a Democrat to participate in the primary election. Period. End of the discussion. It's no wonder that Pennsylvania's on the top of Nick's list. It's the state where he lost. It's way behind the curve, says his ally, Philadelphia civic leader David Thornborough, who wants to scrap a closed system that's nearly 100 years old.
You know, since 1937, when it comes to primary elections, you have to join a party in order to vote. And I mean, we've done all kinds of archaeological digs trying to figure out why this was implemented in 1937. And shockingly, it had nothing to do with independent voters, who were about 2% of the electorate at that time.
As we constantly remind you in our podcast series, independent voters are surging across the country, which we loudly applaud. And here in Pennsylvania, there are 1.5 million of them.
The twin barrels of the argument are that, A, it's unfair. Primaries cost us about $75 million a year. And if you're an independent, you're literally paying for a party that you're not invited to. The other thing is pretty clear is that when you elect people in a primary by a small number of the most rabid voters, you're literally then have the impossible task of trying to govern from the cheap seats in, rather than talking to the whole stadium. It should not be a shock to people that dysfunction, hyperpartisanship, performative politics kind of follows suit after the way we elect folks.
Then there are some primaries that are semi-closed. For example, in New Hampshire, you can be an unaffiliated voter, read independent, and then the day of the primary declare as a Republican or as a Democrat and vote. In fact, as you walk out the door, you can switch back to independent. That was the crowd that rallied to Nikki Haley in her run this spring. And then there are about 20 states that are open. For instance, in Arkansas, you don't have to change your registration. You just ask for the Democratic or the Republican primary ballot. The pushback to many of these reforms obviously comes from party officials. They would argue that a political party needs to have control over who its nominees should be to support the party's ideology and agenda. In crude marketing terms, it's a way simply to protect the brand.
People organize themselves by parties. The reason third parties never get any place, the reason independents never get any place, is because what's an independent? What is it? Nobody knows. Okay, people call themselves independents. They don't know what it is.
That's Elaine Kmark, Clinton administration official and Democratic maven.
Parties are a shorthand for voters understanding democracy. So, if you call yourself a Republican, it means probably you kind of like low taxes and you don't think the government should be in business. If you call yourself a Democrat, you kind of think that the government ought to help out people to a certain extent. Parties are critical to democracies, and otherwise you don't know what you're voting for.
But not all party activists agree. Republican columnist and Virginia voter Bill Kristol.
So I live in an open primary, really a non-party registration state. And I think it's healthy. And I do think it has some ability, independent voters, therefore, or less committed partisans, less extreme people ideologically, have some ability to therefore influence the nominations in both parties.
Now, it's time for me to be the anarchist in the room. Here's another familiar rant from me. How the entire system discriminates against ticket splitters. You can't do this in the general election. For example, what happened in Georgia in 2022, where a Republican governor and a Democratic senator were elected. But no state, not a single one, allows you to ticket split in the primary. You can't vote in the primary for a Republican Senate candidate and then suddenly switch to the Democrat in the governor's race. Party officials would hate that, but I think it would be totally cool. Total chaos and incentivized ticket splitters, who I think could completely transform American politics. Hey, it's America. If I want to buy a regular Coke at the grocery store, I can also throw into my cart Diet Pepsi, an energy drink, and cranberry juice. This whole thing with only two choices sounds a lot like the old Soviet Union to me. But in the end, all this tinkering under the hood of the American election system, redistricting reform, multi-party democracy, rank voting and its variations, and open primaries, what are the actual results?
Listening to candidates, pundits, and partisans, it would be easy to conclude that election laws are ground zero for heated partisan battles, with the United States' status as a democracy at stake. The heated rhetoric around election laws just doesn't match the evidence.
That's from a very interesting study by the Hoover Institute.
Democrats often accuse Republican-backed policies like voter ID of suppressing turnout of Democratic voters. Republicans claim Democratic proposals like mail-in voting invite fraud that benefits the other side. And yet, our research shows that partisan stakes are actually very low. That's because most voting laws only target a small fraction of voters, barely affect turnout rates, or tend to evenly target Democrats and Republicans.
Or how about giving felons the right to vote? Which party gets the edge? Depends on the state. It helped Republicans in 19 states and Democrats in 29. Now, on a philosophical level, I think all of these ideas are worth exploring. I'm a firm believer that the states are the laboratories of democracy. But let's keep in mind again, I've got the entire axis of evil covered. Journalists, U.S. congressmen, and lobbyists. And there's a corner of my reptilian brain that's very cynical. So, before we get all worked up about one plan or another, we actually have the data to analyze the results from 50 very unique state systems.
How much does it matter what kind of nominating system these places have? And it turned out that candidates from the most open states are just as polarized as those from the most closed primary states.
That's Denver University political scientist Seth Mascott, one of my favorite bloggers on Substack. Well, anyway, right behind me.
For the most part, they don't have very many long-term effects. It tends to put a different faction within a party in power. It tends to shuffle things a little bit, but only for a few years, at which point, people do adapt to the system and don't make a lot of long-term changes.
Is it that people figure out eventually how to game whatever the reforms are?
You could say that. Yeah. I mean, that's maybe the more cynical word for it, but yeah, people figure out the rules and they figure out what they want from the system and, eventually figure out how to get it.
My headline on this is party reform. The studies of that show that has very minimal effects, if any. There'll probably be some negative consequences.
That's San Francisco's Jason McDaniel one more time.
And people, what they wish for, what they hope for, what they promise is incredibly unrealistic in terms of what tinkering with the rules of primary elections can actually accomplish.
Well, like an old battered Oldsmobile, America's democracy undoubtedly needs a regular tune-up and maintenance. But remember our cautionary tale in our episode about election security. Cameras in election counting centers after Bush-Gore were going to usher in a new era of election security and transparency. But without a play-by-play of what was going on, every time someone moved a box in 2020 and saw it on video, it fueled rants of election fraud. So the next time you pop up the hood of the car, tweak that bolt, replace that belt, be careful. Today's solutions to America's elections problems could be tomorrow's problem. Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Creative team Claudia Luz and Tony Wood. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Music by Brett William. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance. If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.